my name is Wesley. I'm going to be talking to you today about the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was an Allied fighter during World War II. It was introduced in 1942 and quickly became one of the most iconic and successful airplanes of the war. Today I'm going to be talking about aspects and features of the airplane that made it so successful and iconic, and I have a few interviews and some other pictures and videos that hopefully will shed some light on the subject and make you guys a little more interested in it, because I know sometimes history can be a boring subject. In order to fully appreciate the P-51, we have to take a look at other Allied fighters that were active at the time in order to see what made the P-51 stand apart from the others. We're going to start with the P-47, and then we're going to go to the P-38. The P-47 was a great fighter in its own respect. It had 2 more guns than the P-51, and it could also keep up with it in speed. The area where it lacked, however, was its range. Due to it being a bigger and much heavier aircraft, it only had a range of about 800 miles, which is a considerable problem due to the fact that these aircraft's jobs was to escort bombers to and from their missions and to protect them from enemy fighters. The P-38 also had its pros and cons. Although it didn't have as many guns, the range, or the speed of the P-51, it made up for it by being able to carry much more weight in bombs. This made it a great guerrilla bomber. It would go in behind enemy lines, drop precise bombs, and get out much easier than the bigger bombers could at that time. Now that we've taken a closer look into the Mustang's predecessors, we're going to be taking a closer look into the Mustang itself and what set it apart from those two. One of the most frequently overlooked improvements to the P-51 is the bubble canopy. This clear canopy allowed for the pilots to turn their heads and easily locate their enemies and not have nearly as many blind spots as they would have in other aircraft at the time. Another frequently overlooked aspect of the P-51 is the laminar wing shape. Most airplane wings have a rounded top and a flat bottom, which creates lift on the airplane to keep it aloft. But the P-51 has rounded edges on both the top and bottom, which reduce drag and increase speed, thus making it more fuel efficient, giving it its longer range that it's known for. The next guy you're going to hear from is Rich. He works for Midwest Aero out at the Vermilion County Airport, and what they do is they restore all these old Mustangs. And so I thought, who better to weigh in on the subject than someone who works on them every day. So here are his opinions on what make the P-51 a superior aircraft to the other Allied aircrafts that were operating at the time.
The Americans had good fighter planes, P-47, P-38, etc., and P-40s, but the Mustang was better than them in an all-around way. Some ways the 47 was there, some ways the P-38 was equal, and so on. But they used more fuel because the P-38 had 2 engines, the 47 was a lot bigger, had a bigger engine on it. They couldn't reach Berlin with the airplane. The Mustang was a little smaller, carried 450 plus gallons of fuel with drop tanks on it, and it didn't burn nearly as much, so that's why it was able to go all the way to Berlin and escort the bombers. So that was the biggest advantage of the airplane during the war, was to escort the bombers all the way to the enemy's capital. Whereas before that, the fighter planes had to turn back early, and the German fighter planes would wait till the escorts left, and then they'd go up and hammer the bombers.
So you just heard Rich talking about the P-51 escorting bombers to and from Berlin. This is what won the war. This is one of the most important things that the P-51 did. Because before this, the Allied forces were stuck just doing night raids because they didn't have any other aircrafts that could protect their bombers coming in during the day. So they had to try and use cover of night, which didn't work very well for them, and it was kind of becoming troublesome. So once the P-51 was able to accompany them over to Berlin, This drastically changed the game and allowed them to do daytime bombing raids, which totally decimated Berlin and also destroyed most of Hitler's Luftwaffe air fighters. P-51 Mustang is credited with more downed aircraft than any other aircraft during the war. A bulk of the aircraft shot down by the P-51 is the Messerschmitt Me-109. These planes were much smaller, much slower, and did not have near the range that the P-51 had.
The design of the German fighter, like the Messerschmitt 109, was way back in late 30s design. And so they weren't as advanced. And altitude, they didn't have the altitude. The Germans built over 30,000 of the 109s because they didn't want to worry about advancing the technology of the airplane. They just wanted to build a lot of them and keep throwing them at the enemy. The German fighters did not have the range that the Mustang did. They couldn't carry nearly as much fuel, and so they just pretty much stayed close to home, and we had to go to them. But still, they were sitting over there waiting on getting our bombers, so that's why we sent all these airplanes after them. Once the Mustang engaged with the 109, the 109 was, unless he headed for the deck and ran like crazy, he was pretty much going to be shot down.
After being harassed by the P-51 for a few years, the Germans decided that they needed a new tactic on how to fight it. So, in 1944, they introduced the world's first jet fighter. It was called the Me-262, and although it greatly surpassed the P-51 in speed, it lacked maneuverability and range, which ultimately was its downfall.
It gulped fuel, so it only had a duration in the air of at most an hour and a half. And they were very vulnerable on takeoff and approach to landing, and that's when the Mustangs would get them. They'd catch the 262, get taken off or landing, and the Germans wouldn't send them up until there were Americans in the area, so if they saw them coming, they could pounce on them and get them. The Mustang had enough diving speed and so on. The German jet hadn't gained speed yet.
To sum things up, the P-51 played a monumental role in the Allied victory in Europe during World War II. Not only did it allow for an almost instantaneous change in the air superiority over Europe by allowing daytime bombing raids over Germany with the increased protection of the bombers, it also made a name for itself as one of the single best fighters that there was in that time period. Because not only did it beat all of the aircraft that came before it, but it also was successful against an aircraft that came out 2 years after it, designed specifically to take it out. It's a pretty impressive aircraft that is definitely an important part of the Allied war effort.